So, how much does God know? So, let's talk about God's omniscience and, in particular, what Maimonides says about it. He tries to answer questions around how much does God know about God Himself? How much does God know about species and the universe and such things? But more importantly, does God know us as individuals or does God know us as a species? And for me, this was a very important question because I've always thought it has to be either God knows us as individuals, and I think most people believe this, especially religious people believe this, or God doesn't really know us as individuals, but as species, which to me seems like most probable, given that the vastness of the universe. And when you think of ourselves as individuals, then there are things, a lot of things don't make sense. For example, suffering doesn't make sense when we think of God knowing us as individuals. Things like suffering, death, and poverty, and all kind of things like that don't really make sense, at least to me. But when I think of God as knowing us as a species, then it makes sense. That, at least to me. I don't want to say that that's how it is for everyone. Now, let's see what Maimonides says about God's omniscience. And I decided in this video I'm going to read almost an entire chapter that talks about this. So we start. The philosophers have uttered very perverse ideas as regards God's omniscience of everything besides himself. They have stumbled in such a manner that they cannot rise again. Nor can those who adopt their ideas. I'll further on tell you the doubts. I'll further, I'll, let me repeat that. I'll further on tell you the doubts that led them to these perverse utterances on this question. And I'll also tell you the opinion which is taught by our religion and which differs from the evil, and wrong principles of the philosophers as God's omniscience. So here, the first paragraph, Maimonides starts by telling us that he explains that he thinks or he believes the position that has been taken by philosophers regarding God's omniscience is so perverse, and he thinks they've committed a huge sin, and he thinks there is no redemption for them for holding those views regarding God's omniscience. We are going to see what this is as we read further. He continues to say, the principal reason that first induced the philosophers to adopt their theory is this. At first thought, we notice an absence of systems in human affairs. Some pious men live miserable and painful life, while some wicked people enjoy a happy and pleasant life. So he says that what led some philosophers to hold whatever he calls perverse ideas regarding God's omniscience is that they observed around. All of us have seen this. They are very pious people who are very obedient to God, and they do everything that is required of them as they are taught by their religion, and they live very miserable lives. And on the other hand, there are these people who are not doing anything as required of them by any religious teaching. They are evil. They do things that will make them to be very sinful people, to be seen as very sinful people in the eyes of course, of those who are religious. And these people live a happy and pleasant life. And Maimonides says that this is seeing this in society is what forced some philosophers to then arrive at these conclusions that he thinks are very perverse. He continues to say, on this account, the philosophers assumed as possible the cases which you will now hear. They say that only one of two things is possible. Either God is ignorant of the individual or particular things on earth and does not perceive them, or he perceives and knows them. So he says the philosophers, after seeing this, that pious men live miserable life, and then we have these very sinful people living pleasant and happy life, they concluded that it has to be either of two things. One is that God is ignorant of the individual, like God doesn't recognize us as individuals, so that our individual suffering and our state is not important to God. Or God is aware, but God knows everything. Yeah, that's the first position. I think I'm going ahead of myself. Or God is ignorant of the individual, and he perceives them, and he perceives and knows them, or God is ignorant. It's either of those two. Either God knows us as individual, or is ignorant of us as individuals. These are the cases possible, he says. They then continue thus: if he perceives and knows all individual things, one of the following three cases must take place. So if God knows us as individuals, if we take that to be the case, that God knows each one and every one of us as individuals, and also of other things, animals and plants and things like that, then the following three, then we have these three things that must follow them. One, God arranges and manages humans' affairs well, perfectly, and faultlessly. That is one option. Two, he is overcome by obstacles and is too weak and powerless to manage human affairs. That's the second option. The third option is he knows all things and can arrange and manage them, but leaves and abandons them. As too base, low, vile, or from jealousy, or as we may also notice among ourselves, some who are able to make other person happy, well knowing what he wants for his happiness, are still, in consequence of their evil dispositions, their wickedness and jealousy against it, they not help him to his happiness. So he says these three things now becomes what is likely to be about God. If God knows us as individuals, either yes, he can, and he manages them, and everything is going as it's supposed to be, regardless of whether we like it or we don't. Whatever happens, then God is just doing things the way they should be done, and whatever we think is not going right, it's us having the wrong perception. That could be the case. Or number two, God knows us as individuals, but is incapable of taking necessary steps to manage affairs. Or he knows us as individuals and is capable of doing things, managing affairs, but he just, for whatever reason, decides not to do that. So that's Maimonides is telling us how the philosophers have argued to arrive at what he calls perverse ideas or conclusions. Then he continues, for those who have knowledge of certain things necessarily either take care of things. Okay, still explaining the points of if you know and you are capable of, then you either decide just not to care, or it's still going on with that, but I'll still read that. For those who have knowledge of certain things necessarily either take care of things which they know and manage it, or neglect it, or while they take care of it, have no sufficient power and strength for its management. He's still arguing about the point I've just explained. Now, let me read the next paragraph. Having enumerated these different cases, the philosophers emphatically decided that of the three cases possible, as regards the management of things by one who knows that thing, two are inadmissible in reference to God: want of power or absence of will. So they said, after looking at all those three scenarios, and they decided that two are inadmissible, and those are that God has no power or he has no will, because they imply either evil disposition or wickedness, neither of which can by any means be attributed to him. So they decided we have to drop two. We can't say that God is powerless, and we can't say that God has no will. So now he continues, consequently, there remains only the alternative that God is altogether ignorant of human affairs, or that he knows them and manages them well. Now we just have to assume God is ignorant of human affairs, or he knows them and manages them well. Since we, however, notice that events do not follow certain order, that they cannot be determined by analogy, and are not in accordance with what is wanted, we conclude that God has no knowledge of them in any way for any reason. This is the argument which led philosophers to speak such as blasphemous words. In the treatise on the Providence by Alexander Aphrodiasis, you will find the same, and as I have said about the different views of the philosophers, and as I have stated, to the source of their error. So he has explained to us how the philosophers have come to the conclusion that God is ignorant of us as individuals, because they are like, if God was aware of us as individuals, then he is powerful enough that he can intervene. And for example, then we will not see situations where people who are very pious are living miserable life, while people who are not pious are living happy and pleasant lives. You must notice, he continues, you must not notice with surprise that the evil into which these philosophers have fallen is greater than that from which they sought to escape, and that they ignore the very thing they constantly pointed out and explained to us. He still thinks these philosophers, Maimonides still reiterates that these philosophers, by just arriving at that conclusion, they've committed a big sin, if I may call it so. They have fallen into greater evil than from which they sought to escape, because they refuse to say that God neglects or forgets a thing, and they maintain that his knowledge is imperfect, and that he's ignorant of what is going on here on earth, that he does not perceive it. They also ignore what they constantly point out to us, in as much as they judge the whole universe by that which befalls individual men, although according to their own view, frequently stated and explained, the evil of man originates in himself or form part of his material nature. So he says, he kind of starts telling us where the era of judgment of the philosophers come from. And for him, he thinks it comes from, for them, not linking the two to another argument that many of them hold or put forward, and that is that sometimes we think as humans that things are going wrong because we are looking at things from a subjective viewpoint. We're looking at the universe from a subjective viewpoint, and we expect the universe to do everything for our comfort, and we don't realize that that's not how the universe functions. And this is an argument that is often put forward by the philosophers, and he says these philosophers then ignore that when it comes to talking about the providence, God's omniscience and providence, by arguing that whatever they argued about him being ignorant. And he also says that they fail to acknowledge that much of the evil that happens to us as humans comes from either our own actions or from our own material nature. And indeed, in another video, I did explain that Maimonides classifies evil into three. There's evil that occurs to us from nature, and he says that is not a lot. It's like very minimal. It's very small compared to the entire amount of evil that we have to go through as humans. And he says the second type of evil is evil that others do unto us, and he says that is not as much as we think. And he says that type of evil is evil that we do unto ourselves, we cause ourselves. And he says that is the most numerous. And he says when people argue, or philosophers argue, that God is not acting to protect people from evil, they fail to understand that much of the evil that occurs to us is from us, is what we do to ourselves. We have already discussed this sufficiently. It says, after having laid this foundation, which is the ruin of all good principles and destroys the majesty of all true knowledge, they sought to remove the opprobrium by declaring that for many reasons it is impossible that God should have knowledge of earthly things, for the individual members of species can only be perceived by the senses and not by reason. God does not perceive by means of any senses. Again, so he says we might also have a wrong understanding, because we want to assume that God perceives reality the way we do, and that might not be the case. And Maimonides in much of the book argues about God being incorporeal, and that includes that God does not perceive nature and reality the way we do, but we always think he does that way, because the only thing we know as humans is to perceive through the eyes and ears and touch, the five senses. That's how we can perceive the reality. And because of that, that's the only way we understand that we can or reality can be perceived. And because of that, we wrongly assume that God has to perceive reality the same way. Again, the individuals are infinite, but knowledge comprehends and subscribes the object of its action, and the infinity cannot be comprehended or subscribed. Furthermore, knowledge of individual beings that are subject to change necessitates some change in him who possesses it, because its knowledge itself changes constantly. They have also raised the following two objections against those who hold in accordance with the teaching of Scripture that God knows things before they come into existence. Okay. First, this theory implies that there can be knowledge of a thing that does not exist at all. Secondly, it leads to the conclusion that the knowledge of an object in potential is identical with the knowledge of that same thing in reality. They have indeed come to very evil conclusions, and some of them assume that God only knows the species, not the individual beings, while others went as far as to contend that God knows nothing beside himself, because they believe that God cannot have more than one knowledge. So he talks of further ways that these philosophers are getting things wrong, and he says, even when it comes to looking at the scriptures, some of them says that make this erroneous belief or argument that God knows things in potential, which means before they exist, and which is the same as when they exist, which is I found this argument, and this is not the only place Maimonides tries to make it. He brings it up in another part of the book as well, and I've still remained confused. I don't know where his position is really. I don't know whether he himself believes that God knows things before they exist, or he believes that God only knows of things after they've come into existence. And this brings a lot of confusion, because if we say that he knows things after, in fact, there's another part of the book where he argues that, he kind of argues against that by saying that if we assume that God knows of things before they happen, then we are saying that God changes. It was a kind of like confusing argument. I'll read further. Some of the great philosophers who lived before Aristotle agree with us, and as here means the Jewish teachings, that God knows everything and that nothing is hidden from him. Alexander also refers to them in the above-mentioned treatise. He differs from them and says that the principal objection against this theory is based on the fact that we clearly see evils befalling good men and wicked enjoying happiness. In short, you see that if this philosopher will find human affairs managed according to rules laid down by the common people, they will not venture or presume to speak on this subject. They only led to this speculation because they examine the affairs of the good and the wicked and consider them as being contrary to all rule. And they say, in the words of the foolish in our nation, the way of the Lord is not right. So he argues that those coming to that conclusion that God is ignorant, he is still, for his the final argument, or the ultimate argument he's trying to make, is that it is evil. I think that argument, okay, I think some people can argue that he rushed into just judging them, or branding them in a particular way without sufficiently arguing against the argument. After showing that knowledge and providence are connected with each other, I'll now proceed to expound on the opinions of thinkers on providence, and then I shall attempt to remove their doubt as God knowledge of individuals. So in the next video, we're going to talk about the divine providence, and this is connected to whether God knows us as individuals or he knows us as a species. Yeah, so that's what we'll look at in the next video.